Okay, so today we're going to do something of a lesson uh, on the use of reinforcement in dog training. I've got my list of stuff here. You probably don't need to watch this as a video if you just want to listen to it. That's fine. It's just easier for me to record it that way. And this list really is for me to be checking stuff off. So I think what we're going to sort of reveal over the next little while is the role of reinforcement in dog training. I'm going to touch on negative reinforcement, that's going to come up, but mostly I'm going to focus on positive reinforcement. Uh, it seems like a super basic, really easy topic, but the truth is, um, most people really only have a surface level understanding of the role of reinforcement and how it works and what is reinforcing and why you might want to reinforce something versus why you wouldn't want to reinforce something. And also, why sometimes people think they're reinforcing something when actually they're not. Understanding all of that is what really allows your training to skyrocket forward and really allows you to effectively communicate with your dog what you want and how you want it. So the first thing that we really should do is give definitions of reinforcement. So in line with most dog trainers should be fairly aware of this, but we're going to talk about operant conditioning. We're really talking about just one quadrant. When we talk positive reinforcement, we're going to touch on negative reinforcement. So positive is not positive as in good. It's positive as in to add. And reinforcement literally means to make something more likely to happen, to increase the frequency and likelihood of a behavior. So when we talk about positive reinforcement, we're literally referring to adding something or giving the dog something that is going to increase the frequency and likelihood of a behavior. If we're going to talk about negative reinforcement, negative is to take away, right? So when we're saying these sorts of things, think of it in terms of like positive being plus sign and negative being minus sign. Don't think in terms of good or bad, right? Negative means to take away something that makes a behavior more likely to happen, increases the frequency and likelihood of the behavior. That's negative reinforcement. And so, in general terms, we can give two very obvious examples of what these are. Positive reinforcement, everybody's aware. You go to work every week and you get paid for having done that, right? That's positive reinforcement. You get your paycheck. Negative reinforcement, the best example that we always use is when you get into your car. If you don't put on your seatbelt, the car starts to beep at you and it adds a minor discomfort that then the act of carrying out the behavior, putting on the seatbelt, stops that minor discomfort. So it removes the discomfort in order to make the behavior increase the frequency and likelihood of the behavior, i.e., you putting on your seatbelt. What's important to note about negative reinforcement is that the point of reinforcement is here, right? At the removal of the discomfort. And negative reinforcement has kind of a really bad, at the moment anyway, it has a really bad rap because because people use it pretty poorly, but also they have this idea that the dog first escapes the pressure, the discomfort, and in the future he avoids it. So the old school term you might hear referred to is escape and avoidance training, and that's true. That's exactly right. But the truth is of negative reinforcement is that it doesn't always have to be escape at a low level, avoid at a high level. The truth of negative reinforcement is that a dog will often avoid the negative reinforcement because he knows how to and chooses how to in order to carry out the behavior. It's not that it has to actually be aversive or something that he's concerned about. But that's probably a topic for another time. Today, I really want to focus on positive reinforcement mostly. Negative reinforcement is going to come up. But it's very important you understand that positive reinforcement is to add. That's where your positive comes from. And reinforcement is to increase the frequency and likelihood of a behavior to make the dogs more likely to do it. Okay. Another thing we're going to talk about is the primary and secondary reinforcers. So a primary reinforcer is actually what the dog wants. So it literally could be anything, but it's whatever the dog's desire is set upon. So when we're training, the primary reinforcers that we tend to use would be, say, like a ball or tug, the game sort of thing. It could be food. Sometimes the truth is you can use water as a reinforcer. And one of the things that should never be forgotten as a reinforcer is the release to liberty. Because if you've asked your dog to do a behavior and he's doing that thing, the whatever he was doing prior to being asked to do that behavior is what he wanted to do anyway. So liberty is highly reinforcing for a dog. The core of all dog training, why does a dog do anything, is to better his own situation. So right now, moment to moment, your dog is bettering his own situation. My dog is asleep on his couch right now. That is what he wants to do. So to him, in this moment, that is reinforcing. So when we talk about the primary reinforcer is whatever the dog wants. Like I say, the ones we're likely to use in training, and certainly the most with the most effect, is going to be food. It's going to be toys and gameplay, and it's also going to be the release to the environment, to liberty to just go do whatever you want. Chase birds, sniff the ground, do whatever. I don't care. It's up to you. So that's a primary reinforcer. Uh, the secondary reinforcer is a marker. And so we've talked at length about markers and how to load them and how to use different ones that announce different reinforcers. And, depending on how you train and why, you might choose to follow the techniques that I have laid out on markers, or you may have your own, right? Whatever, it doesn't matter. The idea being that if you say use a clicker, if you use a click and that announces the delivery of food, the food is the primary reinforcer. That's actually what the dog finds reinforcing. But the clicker is what we call a secondary reinforcer. It's a thing that announces the coming of the primary reinforcer. And the main reason, there's lots of reasons why you would want to use markers and why a secondary reinforcer is very important in your training. But the main reason in modern dog training, the reason we would want to do that is that we can be way more precise with the timing of a secondary reinforcer than we can with the timing and delivery of a primary reinforcer. For example, if I'm teaching my dog to go away from me and I'm not luring, right? I'm teaching my dog to go away from me and go to, say, a marker board. The moment he goes to that marker board, I can, via my secondary reinforcer, announce that's what I want. I'm happy with that. And then the dog can come back to me to get the primary reinforcer. The difficulty if you're only working in primary reinforcers, i.e. giving the dog the food, is that if he goes away from you, absent a secondary reinforcer, it's very difficult to properly reinforce the dog and have him understand why he got that reinforcement. If the dog goes away to the marker board and then I have to run over there and give him the food, that is going to be nowhere near as efficient as him going to the marker board by his own choice or because I told him or whatever our technique. When he's there, I say, that's what I like. Now come back to me and get the reinforcer. So that's the role of the secondary reinforcer. Primary reinforcer is the thing that the dog actually finds reinforcing, the thing that will actually increase the frequency and likelihood of a behavior. The secondary reinforcer is the clicker or the marker or whatever you're using that announces and precedes the primary reinforcer. We've talked about this when we talk about markers, but it's very important to understand that your secondary reinforcer, your clicker in this case, acts like a battery. When it's charged, it works perfectly. And when I click, my dog literally feels as though he was reinforced. If my marker is loaded correctly, and especially the way that I've talked about loading it, when I click, my dog feels as though he got the food. It's outside of his control. He literally feels that way. But your secondary reinforcer is like a battery in that that will wear off if the food is not given. So imagine I have my little D-cell battery or whatever I've got, right? And it's fully charged marker. If I choose one day for whatever reason to click and not reinforce, I use a little bit of this. 1 or 2 times is no problem. It's not going to affect the dog. But eventually, if I click and don't reinforce and I click and don't reinforce, I keep wearing out this battery. And I can only do that so many times before my battery goes flat. And my secondary reinforcer is no longer a secondary reinforcer at all. It's just a novel stimulus, a neutral sound. Again, once my battery is empty, I can click and the dog says, well, there's been way too many repetitions between you clicking and delivering a reinforcer. That no longer announces a reinforcer comes, okay? That's important to understand. All right. Like in many things, uh, a lot of what we're going to discuss today revolves around the idea of dopamine jackpot. If you have not watched Sapolsky's study on dopamine jackpot, you have to watch that. Type into Google, into YouTube, dopamine jackpot. You're going to come up, you'll find the video. It's 5 minutes long. It's Sapolsky explaining the process of dopamine jackpot. Um, I will explain it again here because it's so imperative that everybody understand this. So the idea of this experiment was to measure dopamine in monkeys that had a signal to perform a work. The signal was a light being turned on. The work was turning two levers 10 times, and the reinforcer is this banana. It's actually apple juice, right? Because it's funnier to say banana, but monkeys actually really enjoy apple juice, apparently. So that's the primary reinforcer. So there's a light here. Can you see that? Yeah. There's a light here. There's these two levers that need working, and then there's the banana for reinforcement. And what's important to understand is there was a long training process prior to the video that you will watch where these monkeys were taught how to work this system. They were taught that this light is the signal, and for us as dog trainers, we have to understand that that signal is the command to complete a behavior. That is sit, right? That is you actually saying it. When the light goes on, the monkey can work these two bananas, the two levers. He was actually taught that, right? Like they had to be shown this system. And for us, this is the behavior, right? Or the work, right? And then the banana here is our positive reinforcement. When is the monkey the happiest during this cycle? Well, it turns out everybody kind of thought that the receipt of the reinforcer would be when he's the happiest. And in this phase where we join the experiment, that is not the case. What is the case is that the signal is the point where the monkey is the happiness. That's where the spike in dopamine happens. And then that dopamine begins to plummet immediately back down to your base level here at the receipt of the reinforcer, right? And what it shows us is that it's the opportunity to work that is reinforcing. The truth is, I believe that if we got to observe this monkey during his learning phase when he was actually being taught this graph would not be true, right? The receipt of the reinforcer is what's reinforcing. Therefore, that's where the dopamine jackpot, that's where the dopamine would spike. That's the highest point in the dopamine. But then he was taught that the work announces getting the reinforcer. So what would have happened in the learning phase of the experiment, but we don't get to see that, and especially in Sapolsky's video, we come in when the monkey already knows. So what would have happened, there was no signal. In the start, the dopamine spikes for the reinforcer. That's what the monkey wants, right? Through the process of classical conditioning, he comes to understand that doing the work announces the reinforcer. So now the work is what would have announced the reinforcer. And so that's where the dopamine is, and then crashing after that. But then again, through the process of classical conditioning, the signal is added. I tell the dog to sit, he performs the work of the sit, then he gets his reinforcement. Because of the way that happens on a one-to-one schedule, every time he's told to do the behavior, he does it, he gets reinforced in the learning phase, means that by the time he sees that signal, he knows it's a guarantee that he's going to get the reinforcer, the positive reinforcement. So he doesn't have to wait for this cycle to be complete to get the dopamine spike. What ends up happening is exactly what Sapolsky found, is that he's very happy when he sees the light go on, as happy as he was in the learning phase of receiving the reinforcer, because the guarantee knows it's going to happen. And then it starts to plummet all the way down when he actually gets it and he goes, okay, well, back to square one, right? He feels as though he's at square one when he actually receives the reinforcer. Okay, so then we understand they wanted to figure out how can we play with these ratios and how can we move around this dopamine. So they go to a variable reinforcement schedule. That means that now, this is an interesting one that I think a lot of dog trainers misunderstand. A variable reinforcement schedule in Sapolsky's experiment was you are reinforced or you are not. What I see a lot of dog trainers misunderstanding is that they think that the variable package of reinforcement is what brings on this dopamine spike. Now, that may well and very likely is true, but the real spike in dopamine variability and reinforcement happens at the idea of whether there is reinforcement or not whether there is much reinforcement or a little bit of reinforcement. So in Sapolsky's experiment, they decide that 50% of the time they will reinforce. So one of these days, the monkey probably has hundreds of repetitions of the light going on. He performs the work, he gets his banana, he's happiest at seeing the light. Hundreds of repetitions of that. And then one day, the light goes on, he feels fantastic about it, he performs the work, and he doesn't get a banana. But the thing is, he still got that dopamine spike, despite of the fact that he didn't get the banana, because it came at the signal, the opportunity to do the work. Because there were hundreds of repetitions in the bank already, he's convinced that he should have been reinforced. What I see is a lot of people try and rush to that point when they're training their dog. They do like 5 or 6 repetitions of teaching a dog to sit, and then they go, okay, now I'm going to go to a variable schedule of reinforcement, and I'm going to not pay the dog when I tell him to sit. And they get to there too early, and the behavior goes extinct. We'll talk about extinction in a minute. So there's hundreds and hundreds of repetitions here where the dog or the monkey sees the signal, does the work, gets the reinforcer. One day he doesn't get the reinforcer and he's shocked by that. So at the next opportunity, there's now variability, which means that he is twice as happy. There's twice as much dopamine at the signal, but it still goes all the way down, crashes to zero once he gets the reinforcer. In Sapolsky's experiment, they only went to a reinforcer at a quarter of the time, and what they found is that the ratio of reinforcement, the lower it got, was directly proportionate to the increase in dopamine that comes at the signal, at the opportunity to work. So we could talk about this for a long time and extrapolate. I could I could talk to you for 2 hours about the effects of this, but it's very important to understand that there's a learning phase where that reinforcement has to be every single time. The monkey got the banana every single time when he was learning about this system, because the reinforcer, the banana, is actually what's reinforcing. The only reason that the signal becomes the opportunity, that the spike in dopamine, is because it is a guaranteed outcome of leading to the reinforcer. When that guaranteed outcome, yes, it's definitely going to lead to the reinforcer. When that's guaranteed and then it's no longer happens, that variability, it's binary, yeah, like you get it or you don't, right? That variability is what increases the dopamine at the signal, right? The chain begins, because this is a chain. He sees it, he does it, he gets it. That's a chain. At the opening of the restaurant, the chain is available. Okay, now find out whether you're going to get reinforced. It's very important to understand that it's binary. You do or you do not. Okay. So we understand that. That is going to flow into a lot of these other things that we're going to talk about here. But we have to understand that to build long sequences of behaviors, to be able to ask your dog to do numerous things without reinforcing every single one of those behaviors. If you're going to be able to tell your dog to sit, to down, to stand, to heel, to send away, to come back, to go to his bed, all those things, every single one of those behaviors has to go through a learning phase where our monkey, our dog, whatever, is taught in the process of, you get the reinforcer. Now you must do the work to get the reinforcer. Now there's a signal that announces you can do the work to get the reinforcer. And we do all that in a learning phase. There's a guaranteed outcome of the reinforcer. However many reps it takes for your dog to understand that, now we can start going to variable reinforcement and we can start dragging that out, right? We can start dragging out the intervals between reinforcement. And the longer we drag the intervals out, the higher the dopamine spike will happen at the signal, which is our command to do the behavior. I mentioned something just a little bit ago about extinction. If extinction, what we say of extinction, the definition of extinction is that a behavior that goes unrewarded goes extinct. And so what happens is You ask your dog to do something. If he doesn't get reinforced for it, or even if it's just a natural behavior that the dog does, he'll try again, he'll try harder. And if it doesn't work, then he'll just stop doing it because there's no longer success in doing that behavior. Why does a dog do anything? To better his own situation. He gets reinforcement of some value, right? So if he's doing a behavior and he stops being reinforced for it, he eventually will stop doing it. How long he will keep trying depends on where we are at in that cycle. Now, what I said before was interesting, right? You've done 2 or 3 reps of teaching your dog to sit. You ask him to sit. He does it. You don't pay him, thinking that you're going to start soliciting Sapolsky's dopamine jackpot, but it doesn't happen. He then just goes, okay, well, I suppose I wasn't meant to sit. I wasn't going to be paid. I've misunderstood this situation. Sitting is not what you wanted because I wasn't reinforced. That's the behavior going extinct. What we want is to get it to the point where he's sure, he's positive that this should lead to payment. And then an extinction burst will happen, right? An extinction burst is a very fancy way of saying that a behavior has to get worse before it gets better. The subject, the animal, the dog, he will try harder at what he knows leads to reinforcement before he gives up. The example I use in that is this. When you walk into a room every day, you flick the light switch, right? The signal is darkness. You see the darkness. You perform the behavior of flicking the switch, and you are reinforced with light, right? That light turns on. You do that every day. You've been doing that your whole life. You walk into the same room one day, you flick the switch, and the light does not turn on. In that moment, because you have such a significant reinforcement history of the light turning on when you flick the switch, what you will do is try harder, right? An extinction burst will happen, and that will look like you flicking the switch 6 times. And if when you keep flicking that switch, the light turns on at the 6th time, 6 now becomes your new minimum standard for turning on the light. So you'll think nothing of it, and you go, okay, that's what I have to do. And tomorrow, when you walk into that same room, the darkness is the signal. The work is now 6 flicks of the switch to receive the reinforcement. And you'll just happily do that, right? That means that you were reinforced at the peak of the extinction burst. That means that just as you're about to give up, just as you're about to realize that this behavior no longer leads to reinforcement, it did lead to reinforcement. And so instead of the behavior going extinct, the behavior was strengthened. If you are reinforced during the extinction burst, you will try harder and do better at the behavior. You get more committed to flicking the switch. And it's the same with our dog that sits, right? If we have developed a very strong reinforcement history of being reinforced for sitting, when he isn't reinforced, he'll think, well, maybe I'll sit straighter for longer with more enthusiasm, right? And then when he does those things, he is reinforced, he is paid in some way, in one way or another, he'll continue to do it the way he did it that got that reinforcement. Extinction, though. Imagine you walk into that room, you flick the switch, it doesn't turn on. You flick it as many times as you want. You go flick, 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 flick. Eventually, you realize the light is not turning on, and you give up. That behavior has gone extinct. And tomorrow, when you walk into the room, you won't bother trying to turn on the light because it no longer leads to reinforcement. You've given up on the idea of it. Now, in that example, maybe tomorrow through habit, you turn it on, right? Because you've done it your whole life. But the truth is that behavior will go extinct because there is no longer reinforcement. You tried as hard as you could. You did not get the desired outcome. You did not get the expected outcome. You try as hard as you can. You give up. That's an extinction burst. The behavior is extinct. So that's important for us to understand because too many people, when they're trying to chain behaviors together or to build out long sequences of behavior and fade reinforcement, either fade the reinforcement too early, which is very common, or they fade the reinforcement. They don't get to the point of the extinction burst before they bring back the reinforcement, or they go all the way through the extinction burst and don't reinforce, right? And the behavior actually goes extinct. And they do that by accident. So your goal in training when you are using positive reinforcement is to first develop a guarantee to the dog, yes, this behavior leads to reinforcement. And when the dog really truly understands it and is sure of it, That's when you say, no, it doesn't lead to reinforcement every time. And that's when you can start linking numerous behaviors together. But that has to be taught for each behavior. Each behavior has to have a learning phase before it can go to an intermittent phase of reinforcement. I don't want to hear anybody getting upset about me talking about reinforcement being binary, the intermittent reinforcement. The truth is, in Sapolsky's experiment, the monkey was reinforced or he was not. In our learning phase and in our intermittent phase of reinforcement, we can still play with values, right? We can still play with values as to whether it's going to be a lot of reinforcement or a small amount of reinforcement. And that will help for sure. That will help. But when you really go to an intermittent phase of reinforcement, it's binary, right? Is getting reinforced or is not. That is where the dopamine jackpot comes in. Okay, so it's important we understand that before we move on. Let me rub this bit off my board. Okay, so my next thing that I have on the list here is reinforcement values. Uh, as I was just sort of alluding to, you can and should have reward events. So, and there's ways you can do that in the delivery of reinforcers. That will change the value of the reinforcer being given. So sometimes to help understand this, it's better to talk about reinforcers and say value out of 10. I think that for your own dog, if you're a professional dog trainer, you have client dogs, this is not necessarily always possible. But for your own dog, you should be able to line up every one of your dog's reinforcers in order of value. You should be able to say, like, food is here. If you train with various types of food, you should be able to put those on the scale. Though personally, I like for my dog to think food is food. You take what you're given, right? That's not to say I give him shitty food, but he shouldn't. I don't like my dog to be picky in saying, well, today I don't work for kibble, today I only work for meat, right? Food should be food. But your dog, you and your dog should be able to line up your dog's toys, his reinforcers, whatever it is you give to the dog in order to make behaviors more likely to happen, increase the frequency and likelihood of a behavior. You should be able to line those up and say which one your dog prefers over the other. And then using that, you can then create, say, an imaginary value out of 10, where you can say, okay, well, being praised and just going like, yeah, good dog and a pat is a 1 out of 10 to my dog. Food is a 2 out of 10 to my dog. The ball on a string is a 3 out of 10 to my dog. The frisbee is a 4 out of 10 to my dog. The chuck it is a 5 out of 10, right? All the way up. You should be able to know exactly what it's going to be so that you can perhaps put out all those toys and just tell your dog, give it your marker for release to the environment or to reward away from you, whatever, and know with relative certainty which one your dog is going to go to. Because, as I say, reinforcers are not all created equal. Some higher value reinforcers are really going to make a behavior way more likely to happen than others. But that can be tricky in a learning phase because you need to maintain clarity in your dog. So let me use my dog for an example, right? My dog has a medium food drive. When I'm teaching him something new, that's exactly the level of drive that I want him to be at. He really wants the food, but can stay clear enough in his mind to learn well, understand his behaviors, lead to reinforcement, and really become cognitive in what he's doing. Understand that he is being taught something, focus on what he's doing, make the association between what he's doing and the reinforcer that he's getting. Therefore, increase the frequency and likelihood of the thing I want him to do in order to get the reinforcement. If I were to do that with my dog, say with a chuck it or a decoy, my dog would lose clarity and he would be so obsessed with the idea of getting the reinforcer that it would be very difficult for him to understand what it is, what behavior it is that's leading to that reinforcement. So in a learning phase, for me personally, I like to start with food, but every single reinforcer that I'm going to give the dog must be used in the learning phase for me to consider the behavior learned, right? So if I'm going to teach my dog, let's use the example of going to a marker board. If I'm going to teach my dog to go to a marker board and he's aware that I have food, I need him to be able to do that for the food, then for the toy, then for the frisbee, then for the decoy. before I can say, okay, yep, he understands this behavior in all contexts, right? I do that in various locations and with those various reinforcers so that he understands he can be paid with any one of the reinforcers that I regularly pay him with, and he can stay clear enough in his mind to perform the behavior that I want in order to receive that reinforcer. It would be a disaster for me to try and teach my dog some new complex behavior using a bite on a decoy as the reinforcer in the first part of the learning phase. I want to go through a learning phase with food, then the other reinforcers before I get to what is his ultimate reinforcer. And that's when I would name the behavior, but that's a topic for another day. Um, so reinforcement values. The other thing is reinforcers can be stacked, right? So imagine you're going to give your dog a piece of food. Now that might be one unit of reinforcement, but putting prey into that piece of food may create that same piece of food may then now be 2 units of reinforcement because he gets to chase the prey, right? This is why I like the treat bag that I make my dog eat out of, because my dog likes conflict. He enjoys fighting. And so me trying to keep him away from the food, the reinforcer is reinforcing, right? So playing a game of like a possession type game over the thing that I am reinforcing him with makes the process of receiving the reinforcer more reinforcing, therefore kind of giving me more power, more bang for my buck. Okay. So it's important that we understand that reinforcers are not all created equal, right? Just general reinforcement is not the same as any other reinforcement. Kind of goes against what I said already in that I said reinforcement is binary. You do or you don't. That's true, right? You reinforce or you do not. But then there is space within, yes, I reinforce with what I reinforce with and how I present that reinforcer and the effect that that's going to have on the dog, right? So you have these like subcategories within the categories. Hope you're still with me. Okay. There's an interesting point of uh, breaking chains for reinforcement. So something that we talk about quite a bit is the idea that you can use positive reinforcement to, at a moment of an undesirable behavior, to change that behavior. Let me explain how that happens. Everybody would agree that when you're teaching a dog to sit, if he performs a behavior and sits, you mark, reinforce, he comes to you. You have it on command. You can say sit, he knows he must put his butt on the floor, and then you mark and he comes and he gets his reinforcement from you. Eventually a day will come, a repetition will happen where you'll tell the dog to sit and he will give all the signs to you and saying, hey, I know that this in every other case has led to me putting my butt on the floor, you then marking, clicking, and then I get my reinforcement. I'm happy to remove that whole sequence and just go straight to the reinforcement. That happens with every single behavior that you will teach a dog. But when that happens in an obvious behavior like the sit, most people at that moment would think that they are witnessing disobedience. They would say in that moment that the dog is choosing not to follow what they're saying. And the truth is, the dog is just anticipating the sequence and trying to get to the end of it. And in that moment, when their dog doesn't sit and he comes and demands his reinforcement, they'll either not reinforce or, depending on their training method, they may use negative reinforcement back into the behavior, right? Whatever, it doesn't matter. It's very clear to everybody when that happens that the dog is just trying to get to the reinforcer. He's abandoned the actual behavior and just trying to get to it. Most people think it's disobedience and fix it, and they don't understand that the dog has just decided, well, there's a guaranteed sequence of events. I'm happy to remove this middle portion, and I'm happy for you to have the word sit mean come and get the reinforcer. And I want that to happen. It's very important that the dog think that that is the case and can happen, because that means that I am into the sequence that will lead to the dopamine coming from the command, right? That means the same way as Sapolsky's experiment, that the light turning on, the signal, brought on the dopamine. When I say to my dog sit and he thinks, well, that is a guarantee of leading to the reinforcer. Why don't you just give me the reinforcer? That tells me that that sequence is complete. He is getting the dopamine spike there. Now I just have to remind him or instruct him that that dopamine spike is conditional on the work. You just have to, the reinforcer, sorry, is conditional on the work. You still have to do what I've asked you to do in order to get the reinforcer. So we get that. Most people can understand that. Now imagine we have a dog who is reactive to a stimulus, reactive to another dog. And as soon as he begins reacting, I can mark and reinforce and pay the dog. The common thinking would then be, well, that is reinforcing that behavior. And perhaps it is, right? People freak out because they see that and they think that dog is being reactive. That is an undesirable behavior. You are marking secondary reinforcer, and the dog turns back to you and gives the primary reinforcer, right? That's true. You potentially are increasing the frequency and likelihood of that behavior happening. But what's going to happen is there's an anticipation of the release from that behavior. The same way one day when you said to the dog, sit, and he goes, okay, I know that means sit, then marker, then food. How about we just go straight to the food? What will happen for sure is a moment in time will come where the signal becomes the other dog, right? Classical conditioning. The reactive dog sees the trigger and goes, okay, the actual behavior of lunging, barking, growling, whatever it is, that was leading to the secondary reinforcer, the click that leads to the primary reinforcer. How about we cut out that whole middle bullshit and I see the other dog? That's my signal. I turn to you and I just get reinforcement. And in that moment, the opposite of when it was a sit behavior that we actually wanted the dog to do, in that moment, we do mark, we do provide reinforcement. And so our ulterior motive all along was to just have the dog turn to us and take reinforcement. And that is not the behavior of barking, lunging, growling that we're reinforcing all along. The sequence, the chain gets shorter. Now we could talk about mindset and counter conditioning, and all those things are potentially happening in that same sequence. That's entirely possible that could be going down, and likely is, right? But what's happening in the dog's mind, we can never really truly be sure of. But what I can be 100% sure of is the behaviors that I can observe, and that sequence will happen. Where people go wrong in that is that they don't take that opportunity. They do the exact thing that they should do in the sit behavior when the dog tries to cut the chain. A day will come for sure where that dog will see this reactive stimulus. He will look back and say, hey, how about we just lead to the end result, please? And the handler will miss that opportunity. And then the dog goes, okay, well, just like I learned earlier that I must sit in order to hear the mark, in order to get the reinforcer, I've now learned that I must bark, lunge, growl in order to hear the click, to get the reinforcer. I'm happy to continue doing that. And then you have actually reinforced the bark, lunge, growl. There's a trick that you can use in that sequence of is applying negative reinforcement during the bark, lunge, growl. And you want that to be out of that behavior so that you apply a pressure during that behavior. As soon as that behavior stops, that's when you can apply the click and the ultimate primary reinforcer. And in that way, you'll nipopo out of that behavior. The sequence is the same. Everything that's happening is the same. Only now you're giving the dog a motivation not to do the bark, lunge, growl. And he will give you more opportunities. He will actively want to cut that part out of the chain. Whereas in the positive only model, he's not motivated to cut that out other than by efficiency. And if you are not as efficient as your dog and you miss that opportunity, he may never give you another one, right? But by applying a pressure during the unwanted behavior to push the dog out of that behavior, he is now motivated to not want to be in that behavior, right? He receives negative reinforcement out of it. His reinforcer is the relief of pressure at the change of the behavior. So in that way, we kind of double pay the dog for the behavior of not bark, lunge, growl, neutral, standing there, loose leash, whatever your criteria is. Okay, so that's something that I think is important for people to understand about reinforcement. Breaking chains for reinforcement. All right, so now all of this has kind of been building up to this last piece that I want to explain about when to reinforce and why. So, uh, uh, this video is kind of inspired a little bit by something I've been talking about a lot to a lot of people recently, and that is people who uh, are reinforcing their dog too much with too shitty a reinforcer. Let me explain. In the learning phase, I like to give highest value reinforcer that I can and to keep my dog clear. So I don't like to do a lot of reinforcing. I like to do high value reinforcing. So it's always worth my dog's while to continue to perform the behaviors. When I go to a variable stage of reinforcement, like I said, it's rare that I will ever pay my dog with a low paycheck. He either gets paid, and when he gets paid, he usually gets paid very well, or he doesn't get paid. It's binary form of reinforcement, right? Don't get upset by the idea. I still am using variable package of reinforcement, but for me, I like that to be on the higher side because I want my dog to really be working for something that is good, right? The variability, the intermittent phase, I prefer to come from binary. You get it or you don't, right? So, uh, in a lot of dog sports, there are unscored portions, right? There are uh, areas of the critique or the assessment, and then there's the move in between those assessments, and you are unscored in that time, and you're allowed to reinforce your dog with what is available to you on the field. And in that moment, it's usually praise. Now, that was a technique. And you see people, they do their healing, whatever. They get, while the judge is being scored on the healing, they get told, okay, you can play with the dog or you can praise your dog. Now, that praise being a reinforcer is from a time gone by when training was different. When training was mostly negative reinforcement, right? Where training was all about the addition of a discomfort to bring on the behavior and on that to compel the dog into a behavior, and on the completion of the correct behavior or the entry into the correct behavior, the removal of that discomfort was negative reinforcement. What often happened in types of training from a day gone by was that the handler would then praise the dog. And patting and playing with your dog, for most dogs, certainly with mine, is a very low value reinforcer because value is related to scarcity, right? And I am with my dog all the time. I play with my dog all the time. He has access to me all the time. I am constantly patting my dog and telling him how much I love him. So the idea that I do that and he find that highly reinforcing is not likely because there's no scarcity of that. When he's around me, I'm giving him attention. It used to work because what it was a marker for the relief of negative reinforcement. It was essentially people telling their dog, don't worry, in this moment, in this behavior, you are safe. And the dog was reinforced by that because it was the relief. It was negative reinforcement, right? It was the marker for the relief of negative reinforcement. So yank and crank style training. And then when the dog does the right thing, you say, yeah, good boy, that's correct. And it's not that the dog finds you saying, yeah, good boy, that's correct, reinforcing, right? It's not that. It's not that he enjoys that so much. It's that it is the point of the relief of the negative reinforcement that is marked by, yes, good boy, that's correct, here's a pat. So if your training formally was all yank and crank style training, during the portion where you are no longer scored and the judge says to you, you can pat your dog, play with your dog, you could in that moment say to the dog, yes, good boy, you're correct. And he would go, oh, thank fuck. That means that I have done okay and I'm not going to get any sort of, I have performed adequately and I am not going to receive any punitive treatment. That's what will be going on in the dog's head. Now, a dog that is trained just purely that way is not going to score good points, right? These days in modern training circles. So we're using a lot more positive reinforcement. We're getting a lot more flashy behavior. Positive reinforcement leads to flashy, pronounced behavior. Negative reinforcement leads to that reliability, and that's why the fusion of the two is so important, right? One is is not as effective as the both together. So imagine you have your super flashy trained dog who's used to receiving very high value reinforcers, and you're on that field, and the judge says scoring is finished, you can praise your dog. When you look down at your dog and you say, yeah, congratulations, good boy, that is a shit reinforcer to your dog who is used to the high intensity game, right? And where people go wrong is they don't do that during training, because why should you, right? What you want is a flashy, powerful dog. So I don't give very low value reinforcers in that way, right? Because my marker for praise, just doing it, yeah, good boy, it can't get any better than that. Praise is praise, right? So I can't be really variable. It's not something I'm going to use a lot of. So when you're on the field and you say to your dog, yeah, good boy, that is not highly reinforcing to him. But what it does do to him is it tells him that that's all that's available, and that you're not carrying any other toys, because this is the picture of me when I have no reinforcers to give you, no primary reinforcers. And so that reinforcement in that moment of, yeah, good boy, is not reinforcing, right? Increase the frequency and likelihood of a behavior. If you underwhelm the dog in such a way that it's totally outside the scope of what he was expecting to receive, you are not in that moment increasing the frequency and likelihood of the behavior. What's actually happening in that moment is punishment. You are decreasing the frequency and likelihood of the behavior. So what you regularly see is dogs that are asked to perform the behaviors. They enter the field really well. They enter the field because the people have a good routine for entering the field, and the dog hasn't yet realized that there is no possibility of corrections. He's not wearing the right equipment, right? There isn't, and we're not allowed to do that on the field anyway. So there is no possibility of that. And through, careful placement of their reinforcements during training, the dog looks and says, "This picture is no different to my training picture. Therefore, there's a high probability of reinforcement on the field. I will perform all the behaviors that you ask of me as though it is going to lead to a high value reinforcer." We ask the dog to do a variety of behaviors. He looks good doing them. Then we say, it's essentially when you look down and say to your dog, yeah, good boy, you essentially look down and you say to your dog, I'm not going to pay you, but I continue to expect to keep working for me through another 2 sections of this test. That is literally what happens to the dog. And what we see in that moment, a lot of dogs then realize, shit, I'm wearing a collar or whatever. I can be compelled to do these behaviors, but I will not be paid well for doing them. The best I can hope for is just me getting told, yeah, I'm a good boy. And to me, that is not highly reinforcing, because I have a good owner who spends all day telling me what a good boy I am. So that is not reinforcing in this moment. What is safer thing to do on the field is to solicit Sapolsky's dopamine jackpot, use your extinction burst to be able to get your dog through an entire routine absent any reinforcement. You want, if your sport is a 7 minutes of work, you need your dog to have worked in training for 9 minutes with no reinforcers, so that you are safely getting your dog through the entire program in the binary system of, am I going to get it? And if I get it, it'll be great. Or am I going to get it or not? And if not, I just keep working until I do, right? So when the judge at the end of your section says to you, yep, okay, you can reinforce your dog, don't reinforce the dog unless you can actually reinforce a dog. Unless you can actually reinforce, by the definition of the word, increase the frequency and likelihood of the behavior. Unless you can give something to your dog in that moment where he actually feels like, fuck yes, it was worth putting in the work that I've put into this point. I want to get another opportunity to do that. Therefore, I'll continue to work. If you can't do that, don't reinforce. So for me personally, I never, ever, ever would say congratulations to my dog. It literally means nothing. But to appease a judge on the field, when they say that section is complete, reinforce your dog, I look at him and I say congratulations. And it means nothing to my dog. He's still locked into behavior. And we do not reinforce. So as far as he's concerned, he's still in that binary system of, at the end of this, I'm going to get a very high value reinforcer, but I don't know when the end is, and it certainly isn't now. I have to stay in behavior and continue to work. And through careful and considered training, we've got that to the point where it's long past the routine that we're actually being assessed on, the routine that we're actually being scored on. It's long past that. And what's actually happening is the longer it goes, the closer he thinks he's getting to reinforcement, and the closer he's getting to reinforcement, the more power and intensity is going to display into those behaviors. So he's going to actually get better as he goes along. Now, of course, when I say he's in an extinction burst, he's going to get better until he eventually gives up, right? But if in training I have pushed that past the point of where he actually is going to give up on the field, if I know in training he can work for 9 minutes before he starts to taper, and I have been reinforcing at the peak of that before he starts to taper, but my competition is going to be 7 minutes long, or 15 behaviors, and in training I can do 20, whatever your metric is, doesn't matter. As long as in training he will work for longer than you require him to in competition, it is foolish, it is counterproductive, and it will not serve you to reinforce your dog with, or to give a shitty reinforcer to your dog on the field. It will not increase the frequency and likelihood of a behavior, and therefore it actually is not reinforcement. There you go. So that's kind of where we're leading to with this. The last thing I wanted to say about reinforcement, and this is another one percenter for things in dog training, is that uh, a lot of behaviors to dogs are in and of themselves reinforcing, right? So if your Malinois is playing tug, he doesn't need to be told by you in that moment that he's doing well, right? That is not part of the picture of reinforcement. You're probably just getting in the way. If your dog is on a spring pole and he's busy fighting away with it, he's enjoying doing that. You going and getting involved and telling him he's doing a good job is not reinforcing. What he's doing is reinforcing. The work in that moment is reinforcing. You being a part of it is not going to help. In fact, you're only likely going to diminish the his intensity into that behavior because he's now concerned about you being a part of it, right? So this really confuses me when I see people like congratulating their dog and telling their dog good work for biting, right? Or while the dog is working sheep, they're saying, "Yeah, good boy, well done working those sheep." Right? He's doing what he enjoys doing. While he is pursuing his reinforcer, you congratulating him on it is not reinforcing, right? So this is one of the reasons that I don't like to. I don't think I have it on board here. I am not into duration markers um, because they're not usable in competition, but also a lot of the time they become noise to the dog, and the dog is lost without them. It's like a constant keep on going signal, right? If you have to give a keep on going signal to your dog while he is receiving his reinforcer, you have created a massive problem with your dog, right? Your dog is way too handler dependent. So I see people doing that, right? Like the dog has to be congratulated all the time during something that he should naturally find reinforcing. And that is a dog that is way too handler dependent and cannot lose himself in the behavior and therefore find it reinforcing, right? Um, so don't do too much of that. It's crazy. I think that's it. The the point is this whole nearly hour long video is we're still really only scratching the surface about as much as I would like to try and explain on every one of these individual topics. Um, we've covered most of it in reasonable detail. But the point is, you must understand what is reinforcing to your dog and understand the definition of reinforcement to be anything that increases the frequency and likelihood of a behavior. If it's not going to increase the frequency and likelihood of behavior, don't do it. It's not reinforcing. You have to understand that using what you think is a low value reinforcer because it's the best you're allowed at the time or it's the best that you have, you are more often than not better served by not reinforcing at all and keeping your dog into behavior until you can find an appropriate reinforcer or get your hands an appropriate reinforcer, because that will, first of all, solicit Polsky's dopamine jackpot. You're at a variable schedule of reinforcement where you must be to have a trained dog. He must be able to chain multiple behaviors together without reinforcement. You are way better off keeping your dog into behavior, soliciting Polsky's dopamine jackpot, keeping him there until you can deliver an appropriate reinforcer, something that the dog actually finds reinforcing. And certainly for the thing that your dog just did very well, perhaps he doesn't get reinforced in that moment, but it all adds to the sequence that will lead to reinforcement. So you're much better off with that. Now, I know not everybody's into competition, and the examples I've given are competition based, but imagine you are walking down the street and you have your dog, you have no reinforcers available to you or on you, and your reactive dog suddenly starts, you see the trigger for your reactive dog, and you see the behaviors coming on that are going to be a disaster. And in that moment, you recall the dog and it goes perfectly. Right? The dog comes flying back thinking, okay, I've made a good choice. I've been taught to recall. I'm going to do the thing that I know leads to positive reinforcement, or at the least, I'm going to avoid the negative reinforcement that will come for the display of behavior that I'm not allowed to show. The dog comes back, and in that moment, you go, yeah, good boy. Yeah, here's a cuddle. In that moment, you fuck the dog over, because he then goes, well, hey, I did the exact behavior that you asked of me, and you gave me a shitty reward compared to the thing that was down there, right? That was a 9 out of 10. Getting to fight that other dog or be reactive or whatever was a 9 out of 10. Chase that bird, whatever it is. That was a 9 out of 10 to me. I came back to you for the 10 out of 10. You gave me a 1 out of 10. Have I increased the frequency and likelihood of him coming back in that same situation next time? No, I have not. All right. What is safer and better for the long-term training of the dog is when you are successful in asking the dog to do a behavior that you want, if you cannot pay that dog appropriately for him, then ask for a whole bunch more behaviors until you can use one of those behaviors to get yourself into a position to provide reinforcement that is reinforcing. So same deal. I'm out on the street. I've got nothing on me. I see my dog reacting in some way that I can't have. I call him back. Instead of when he gets back saying, yeah, good boy, I'm then going to ask him to heel. I'm going to ask him to down. I'm going to ask him to sit, whatever it is that can series of behaviors. Ask him to heel. We walk to wherever we need to go, and then I pay him, and I pay him fucking well in that time, right? And that whole sequence gets reinforced, including the call off of what I really needed him to do. And then is he therefore more likely to do it next time? Yes. Very much more likely to do it next time than if I had in the moment gone, yeah, congratulations, but I have nothing to give you. And what I would then do personally was, because the actual behavior that I wanted wasn't directly reinforced with a primary reinforcer, I would set that up again. I would try and put myself into that exact same position where I could call the dog and I could then pay him with a value of a reinforcer of greater value than what he gave up in order to come back to perform the task. Because we have to remember, like I said right at the start, the primary reinforcer is whatever your dog wants to do. So if it's chasing a bird, if I ask my dog he likes to chase birds. If I ask my dog to not chase a bird and come back to me, I have to pay him with something that is higher value than chasing the bird in order to actually increase the frequency and likelihood of the behavior. That's the sequence. That's how it works, right? So, like I say, the point is, consider what you want to reinforce, why you want to reinforce it, and is it actually reinforcing? By the definition of the word, is it going to increase the frequency and likelihood of the behavior? If it's not, don't give your shitty reinforcer that is actually in that moment a punishment. That's it. I hope that makes sense to everybody. Like I say, we've only scratched the surfaces of a lot of this. There's so much more that I would love to cover on it. And hopefully one day we get the chance to do that together. Thank you.